Resuming debate.
Resuming debate.
Resuming debate.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Resuming Debate. This is a particularly exciting one for me. In December, in particular on December 14th, Parliament voted on two measures that I had put forward that reflected long-running projects that I've been working with various communities on regarding human rights in China. We were informally calling it Freedom Day in our office because of the unique circumstance of having these two projects coming to a point of completion on the same day. Three of the people that I worked very closely with on these are joining us for the podcast today. So Grace, Sherap, and Kayum, it's great to have all of you here. Let me maybe just set the stage a little bit. So these two projects are both related to, in particular, some of the persecution that's happening of minorities in the People's Republic of China. One is a bill to ban forced organ harvesting and trafficking, to make it illegal for a Canadian to go abroad and participate in organ harvesting and trafficking. And the other was a motion to call for the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan community have been asking for a long time with regard to the status of Tibet. That is genuine autonomy for Tibet. And so both of these measures were voted on the same day and both passed unanimously in Parliament, marking significant policy shifts, I think, for the Government of Canada and concrete steps that will make a major difference. And it was a wonderful day. We had people from all of these different affected communities in Ottawa. We did a rally on Parliament Hill. We did a walk to the Chinese embassy, and you know, there were people in the gallery to observe those votes. So Grace is from the Falun Gong community, Sherap from the Tibet community, Kayum from the Uyghur community, all together working on these projects and together with us on December the 14th. So Grace, why don't I start with you? If you can share a little bit about the organ harvesting issue. This is an issue that affects many different people in different places around the world, but I think the Falun Gong community has been really the lead in terms of highlighting this issue because so many Falun Gong practitioners have been victims of this in China.
Yeah, sure. And I think it's really encouraging. And for after so many years that the bill passed, it's really significant and very meaningful. You know, for the Canadian Parliament, unanimous pass it to at least to acknowledge the issue is serious. It is important. You know, in China, like since 2006, David Matas and David Kilgore had did a thorough independent investigation on this issue. They have concluded that a large number of Falun Gong practitioners have been targeted for their organs and sold by the state for profit. And this is a crime unprecedented on this planet. That's their conclusion. And that was involved by the government agencies and its state-sponsored, is systematically happening with a large number. They have been working and advocate on this issue to raise awareness worldwide to like over 50 countries. They talk to different parliaments, and they testified in the different government committees and parliaments. And they also published the second report in 2016. In that report, they give even more shocking evidence and the facts that there are about 60 to 100,000 organ transplants happening in China each year. And that will come to probably millions of people have become victim to this the evil practice in China that virtually had no organ donation system. How can they have so many organ transplants? And so that's also one of the factors that there are so many organ transplant is motivated by money. We know that they want to make a profit, and international organ tourism is a big part of it. To pass the law that's to prevent Canadians from going to China for this organ tourism practice is a significant prevent Canadians from become complicit of this practice, you know, in this killing process. Also send a strong signal to China, to Chinese people and Canadian people that our parliament, Canadian government, you know, acknowledge the things happening, and so like does not tolerate this, and so like because the people who participate will be punished, they will be held accountable, and especially for those who actually are involved in the organ harvesting of innocent people, like those doctors or whoever in the process. If they are identified, they could be prosecuted, or if they could be denied entry to Canada. And so the people who do the bad thing, they have there will be a consequence. And so that sends a signal to them. So then they will have an effect of lessen this. People will start to think about this, like they are held accountable, right?
Yeah.
And so
you're just saying it's us doing what we can about it, right? So there's this horrible crime happening. People are being killed for their organs. There are different factors driving it, including animus towards the minority communities. But one of them is demand. When you have cases of Canadians or other people from other countries that are desperate, that go to China for an organ, and they're willing to pay significant amounts of money, that increases the number of people that are going to be killed and see their organs harvested. So preventing Canadians from doing that, it's not going to stop the whole thing, but it's going to reduce the numbers and save some lives, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so that's the whole thing is about saving life. That's very key. So there's one doctor in Toronto, organ transplant doctor, and he was, I think, 2014 in the forum. He said that there were over 50 of his patients had gone to China for a new organ, but at that time he said that he could do nothing about it. He would not even advise those people not going. Even he knew like someone will be killed. He said the China's donor is that after you donate, you're dead. So like then now, like at least also that empower doctors to do something. There's lots of things that has been happening that will like significantly reduce the people who go to China. That's already happened in other countries who had the similar legislation, like Israel and other countries. They had a sharp like reduce of people going to China for organs.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. I mean, obviously it's a horrific crime, but it's good news that, you know, it's so many years working on this legislation that it's finally passed. And Senator Atulajan was the leader on it, putting it in the Senate. I sponsored it in the House of Commons, and we had previous MPs, Erwin Kotler and Boris Yashnevsky, put forward versions of the bills previously. Kayum, if you can speak to the Uyghur experience a bit around organ harvesting, because for a long time the kind of focus of awareness was around the Falun Gong practitioners as victims, but now there's evidence coming out, significant victimization of Uyghurs as well as part of organ harvesting and trafficking. What are you hearing from the community about that, and what's your take on the impact of this bill?
Well, thank you for having me, Garnet, and Happy New Year to all participants and our listeners. Let me start with congratulating all of us, for having this resolution passed as 223. Even by Canadian standards, it's been a long time, like 14 years in making, and we cannot but mention those who've been behind this drive. In my mind, we should probably mention your late colleague Garnet, Honorable David Kilgour.
Absolutely.
He was like a driving force behind this, and human rights defenders like David Matas and Honorable Aaron Kotler, and all these dedicated people who've been forcing this to be happen. When we'll come to the concrete steps, I would say that Falun Dafa is not an exceptional case. There are many others who are victim of this systematic state-sponsored organ harvesting, and same as the Tibetans and Uyghurs. So this is not a unique case, and we are all victims of the same regime. What differs in our case, probably because of our religious confession, right now and before, China used to market our organs as halal organs, targeting rich Middle Eastern clientele and saying, these are halal organs coming from, Muslims who do not consume pork or alcohol. Mm-hmm. So that was a niche, advertising for rich Middle Eastern clientele. But even that, right now, what we are seeing, what we are hearing, because of the international, publicity and outcry, more and more attention being diverted into internal medical tourism. That is, rich, ethnically speaking, Chinese citizens from Eastern coastal areas with rich, revenues tend to travel into our region to get organs. And this is very disturbing because, in Canada, in Western states, the normal practice would be a waiting list going up to 8, 10, 15 years. And if you're lucky, you can get this much needed organ. In China, if you're in need of a particular organ, you literally can order them and you can get within a very short time span, within the weeks, these needed organs. You can travel there and you will be matched with potentially 3 donors. So the question is where this organ's coming from, ethical part of it. And we do know it's a public secret. They come from they come from concentration camps, victims who end up in camps. Well, putting that even aside, we have adopted this law. It is very good. It is very, it's good for our consciousness that we have this thing finally. But what about implementation? What is the control mechanism? This is the biggest problem in my mind, and I can elaborate more after we will make a round with Sherap. I'll pass it to Sherap. I would certainly want to elaborate and talk more about implementation and control.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think first we need to look at these initiatives, but then we'll talk about getting them passed and then what the future holds, because I think there's this bill is passed on organ harvesting, but how do we make sure that doctors are aware, patients are aware that there's effective reporting and prosecution? But just to your point, I think one of the things that really resonated for me when I was first learning about this issue was the fact that given what's being advertised, you can get this type of organ. It will be available on this day at some point in the future. That cannot happen in a situation where the organs are. I mean, in Canada, if someone dies in a car accident and they've signed their donor card, then their organs become available. But of course, you don't know in advance that that's going to happen, right? So it's a very waiting list, immediate, unexpected thing. Whereas if you're booking in advance that a vital organ is going to be available on this particular date in 5 weeks, then we know that someone's being killed for that organ. So kind of two initiatives bearing fruit on the same day. One was the organ harvesting issue, and the other was a motion on genuine autonomy for Tibet. Sherap, for the totally uninitiated, I wonder if you can kind of explain what is genuine autonomy all about as a proposal. So the Chinese Communist Party invaded Tibet. Prior to that, Tibet had been a separate country, but Tibetans are not seeking independence. They're seeking genuine autonomy. So what is genuine autonomy, and why the focus on that proposal and leading to this, the Canadian Parliament adopting and supporting this position?
Thank you, Garnet. So genuine autonomy, whether Tibetans are seeking genuine autonomy for Tibetans inside Tibet or the independence, but the context and the background is that we seek genuine autonomy based on the history that Tibet was historically an independent country. Tibet was historically a case of illegally invaded nation, but we're seeking genuine autonomy. And the focus is on the word genuine because China currently calls the Tibet as a Tibet autonomous region, at least one part of Tibet. The traditional Tibet has been broken down into several pieces, including the so-called Tibet autonomous region, and then the other areas of Tibet, including the area where His Holiness the Dalai Lama was born. The traditional Amdo region of Tibet has been integrated into what is currently as the Qinghai province. And the many parts of traditional Kham area where my parents were born is integrated into the Sichuan, currently Sichuan province of mainland China. So when we talk about genuine autonomy, it's, as you mentioned in the debate on the 13th December, you're not just talking about Tibetans in the so-called TAR, or the Tibet Autonomous Region. We're talking about Tibetans in all traditional areas of Tibet. The autonomy to really practice your language, culture, religion. We have in the last few decades, Tibetans have come under a really systematic, organized attack on their identity. And the Tibetan identity is really closely linked to our religion, Tibetan Buddhism. So there has been kind of a really organized attack on destroy what is Tibetan Buddhism, Tibetan language, Tibetan culture, to minimize the destruction and to resolve the 70 years old Tibetan conflict, Sino-Tibetan conflict. Canada-Tibet committee that I work for, we have been asking for the last 35 years to the Canadian government, to the Canadian Parliament, to the Canadian civil society to support the resumption of dialogue between the two groups, the representative of Tibetan people and the representative of Chinese government. So in that context, we have had several meetings, of course, over the many years. And personally for me, since 2018, the last 5 years, we have had several testimonies, as you know, in the House of Commons and different committee meetings. We have had several joint letters, all asking for a strong, concrete action for the resumption of dialogue, negotiation between these two different groups. And that finally happened this year with you leading this action. This is a very significant win, very significant support to Tibetans, especially to Tibetans in Tibet for many reasons. But I would just briefly say for the following reasons. One is to resolve the Sino-Tibetan conflict, which has been going on for the last 70 years, right? And two, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the unifying figure of Tibetan people, is 87 years old today, and he will soon be 88 years old. And there's a sense of urgency for all Tibetans and Tibet supporters that Tibet issue should be resolved while His Holiness is still alive with us. And this is not just for Tibetans, but even for the Chinese government. I think while His Holiness is still there, who has been advocating for the nonviolent approach to resolve the issue, I think it makes sense for even the Chinese government to sit on the table and discuss the Sino-Tibetan dialogue issue. And third issue, the political issue. In the recent years, Tibet issue has been kind of limited to the issue of human rights issues, and it's been really limited to the issue of ethnic minority issue. But many seem to have forgotten or ignored or unaware that it's actually an issue of international conflict. As I mentioned earlier, an issue of one country illegally invading another issue. So support to this motion is a step really closer to speaking out on the political nature of Tibet. You mentioned this very clearly during the debate that it's not just the human rights issues, it's a political issue of Tibet. The rights of self-determination. Tibetan as a distinct national, going back to your debate point, a God-gifted and internationally codified law, rights of self-determination for the preservation of their identity, including language, culture, and religion. The Sino-Tibetan dialogue, which seeks the genuine autonomy for all Tibetan, not just limited to Tara. Add on the Falun Gong issue, the organ harvesting, just I wanted to add my personal experience. My mother recently had an organ transplant. She actually had a kidney transplant just 3 months ago here in Toronto. And we have, as a family, we have been going through this experience because she was under dialysis for the past 2 years. So someone as a family member, someone who had the organ transplant, it is, for us, it's unimaginable. The idea of buying or selling organs, just unimaginable.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, one of the things that I'll just put in here is when we're talking about forced organ harvesting and trafficking, there are many people that are very desperate because they or their family members need an organ, and that's why I think voluntary donation is so important, right? It's wrong to be involved in organ harvesting and trafficking, regardless of how desperate you are, but to avoid people being in that situation, signing your donor card, voluntary donation here in Canada, and I'm sure, Sherap, something going through receiving that organ that somebody donated, somebody chose to give, underlines the importance of that. So thanks for just explaining the genuine autonomy issue, because it is an important distinction, right? That of course we talk about human rights for people in Tibet, language rights, freedom of religion, and that's definitely part of it, but we also need to recognize the unresolved political nature of this, that Tibet was invaded. And this parliamentary motion, I think, is a real shift in terms of recognition by Parliament. My sense is that up until now, the government had really, when pressured, they had said some of these things about human rights in Tibet and their members proactively, but not this sort of discussion of the unresolved political nature of that, and how the reason why Tibetans are part of the PRC is because of an invasion, and that requires the dialogue there, genuine autonomy. Did I get that right? Is there anything you want to? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So this is a shift, and but unanimous passage in Parliament, and so there's these some of these different issues, different circumstances of facing minorities, and then we all came together December 14th. We had the vote. I wonder if the three of you could speak a bit to kind of the intercommunity solidarity dimension of this, the fact that, there are similarities and differences between the human rights concerns of different minorities in China. Of course, there's democracy activists in China, people who are not affiliated with any faith community or minority community, who are nonetheless opposed to what the CCP is doing. One of the things that was really moving to me about these things happening on the same day was the opportunity to have collaboration among different communities. How important is that, and how is that happening in Canada, where people are learning about the experience of others and being able to kind of pool their ideas and their resources?
Yes, absolutely. This was very encouraging to see our friends from Uyghur community, the Falun Gong community on December 14th, and on other occasion as well, to see friends from Hong Kong community to come together, because we're dealing against, a huge force that is China. As Kayum mentioned earlier, we are all the victims of the same authoritarian regime. And to see that, we are all come together, not just for lobbying, but also for a rally from Parliament Hill to the Chinese embassy. This was very empowering for me as an individual. And I've seen this kind of solidarity among different groups, more so in recent years. There is a formal coalition called Canadian Coalition on China, which has, I think, played an important role as well. My personal observation is that when we have a strong cause and leaders who listen to your concerns, and you have personally played an important role as well. I've been observing this. I really hope that we can, this is not just one singular event, but I hope to see more of us to come together, because this was a good example that when we come together, government listens to us. Tibetan as one community is not a big community. I mean, even in the whole Tibet, there's only 6 million Tibetans. And in exile, we are over just a little under 200,000 in whole world, including about 10,000 in Canada. But when we join forces with our friends from Hong Kong, friends from Falun Gong, friends from Uyghur, East Turkestan, it just makes us, anyone, whether it is politicians or government or media, they tend to pay more attention. And yeah, this is what I wanted to share on it.
Intercommunal solidarity and campaigning is very important. There is no doubt in it. And when we unified, we can deliver, our voices can be more stronger. But my take is maybe, we should look beyond that and maybe counter CCP propaganda, especially taking into consideration the Chinese interference in our domestic issues. And one of the, rebukes from Chinese communists when it comes to the human rights issues is, this is, it's invented, it's post-colonialist narrative, and these so-called democracies, they do not want China's rise, et cetera, et cetera. This is a narrative we hear a lot, and they add to this anti-Asian hate and discrimination, to which we can, as a coalition, we can say, the first victims of the Chinese regime are Chinese people themselves. That's for sure. That's an obvious statement. That's an obvious fact. Secondly, when it comes, for example, for Uyghurs, yes, Canadian Parliament was the first legislative body in the world recognizing Uyghur genocide. But just recently, on the eve of the new year, Taiwanese Parliament, they have recognized the same crime, and they say this is a genocide. Taiwanese are ethnic Chinese, and they are Asian, so there is no such thing as an anti-Asian discrimination, racism. People in the West, they sleep and dream, undermining China's rise and development. This is not the case. That's a point which we would like to counter as a coalition. That would be useful. And yes, absolutely, we are facing the same, Goliaths in the face of a Chinese Communist Party, that mammoth, which is ruthless, and they do everything possible in an inhumane to get their perceived goals. And what is most depriving or most alarming is that they do this on behalf of Chinese people. They say, we're doing it on behalf of Chinese people. It's a Chinese dream, and such, etc. I don't share this. I don't think that, this self-appointed government can represent Chinese people. A very important distinction to make as a coalition, as human rights activists in Canada.
Yeah, so I mean, I think one key takeaway from what you're saying is that intercommunal solidarity has to include the Chinese Canadian community, right? Grace would love to hear your take on it. Of course, Falun Gong practitioners as well as Chinese Christians are situated a little bit differently from Uyghurs or Tibetans or Hong Kongers, right? Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Hong Kongers are in regions that are specific regions within the PRC. They have a specific experience related to where they are, whereas Falun Gong practitioners and Chinese Christians are everywhere, and they are invisible minorities within China. So, would love to hear your thoughts on building that tie of solidarity.
Yeah, yes, that's you're absolutely right. That the persecution of Falun Gong, is nationwide. Like in all the 30 provinces and autonomic regions, it's everywhere. I think like and also the Christians, and also the human rights defenders, and democratic activists. And also, I think the victim is all over China, like the forced housing, like eviction, like the people lose their house. There's many different kind of human rights violations happening in China. I think the real issue is really not about regional or ethnic groups. I think the whole China is the Chinese people are persecuted by the communist regime. It's all like come to how we are weakened, to realize not only by the different groups, and I think by all the Chinese people, and also by the people all over the world, like in other countries, like in Canada, and also in the US and internationally, how we can realize the evil of the Communist Party, because that's the root cause of all those the atrocities, human rights violations, transnational repression all over the place, and they are extending the persecution to Canada, not only to Falun Gong, to different groups, and also they persecuting, I think, our officials when they have such deep interference, export the communist ideology propaganda, and they coerce our the government people, like government or public, to follow the Communist Party line in many different ways. We know. Go back to this organ harvesting issue. When it's 2006, when the first, like actually before 2006, before the persecution of Falun Gong, they take organs from executed prisoners, and then they eventually extend to the Falun Gong in a large scale, because the massive arrest and the massive people of Falun Gong practice in the prisons and the labor camps, etc. But after so many years of non-action, almost like there's no response from the international community, and so like they are boldened. They continue with the Uyghurs, and so like then after the Uyghurs, what happened? There are massive young people are missing in China nowadays, and people have been lots of discussions and talkings on the internet. What happened to them? And so like a lot of people speculate they also become the victim of organ harvesting. Now like the victim, like they become larger and more massive. And so like this is something that the action, the response need to be solidarity from all the society, internationally, and by the Chinese people, and by all. So like it is very, unfortunately sad, like it takes 14, 15 years for the bill to pass, right? And so like then in this period, how many people killed, and how like they evolved to even more victims. But on the other hand, we also see the positive side is we see the persistence, our continued effort can make difference, right? And I also like expressly thank you to the people who have didn't give up in the process of this 14, 15, 16 years, like from Boris, Urban Kotler, and the past to you, Garnet, and with Senator Tolija, like years and years, and hearings and hearings. We have seven, I counted, we have seven different numbers for this same bill. And this is so important, like it's uphill battle. And so like with the people from different party, from different groups, we work together. And so now we made it happen. But I think with more people realize it, this process raises a lot of awareness. I think that's the positive side. And so people know how significant, so we can work together. So like every voice counts. The big evil power of the Communist Party, we have to working together. By all the people, or even the Chinese people. I think what we are doing here in Canada, also a big support, big support to the people in China, regardless where they are. And, so they need also to find ways to fight for their freedom, to find ways what is good for them, for the people, Chinese people, and for the future of China. And also has such big impact to all over the world. So it's also good for Canada and for all the other countries as well.
Yeah, thank you. And that's a good segue into talking about what is next. Now we're in a new year, 2023. There's more work to do with these initiatives passing, have them realize their full potential, but also recognizing the growth of other challenges, foreign interference in Canada, other human rights abuses in China. There's also potentially new opportunities with, I think, some people inside of China being prepared to protest for freedom and democracy, and the signal that has sent.
Well, it's all good to have such legislative measures framing what is legally can be done and what is legally punishable. This is very good step in a good direction. But the question is, what about implementation? What about control mechanism? I'll give you an example. United States, they adopted, Uyghur Labor Prevention Act. It's been like 18 months in making. And within that 18 months, they have the U.S. Customs, they have seized close to 4,000 containers, merchandise tainted by Uyghur slave labor force, entering U.S. And in the same time, in Canada, none of it happened. Like not a single shipment was seized, confiscated, or asked. So the question is, okay, it's all good that we have these measures. Like in Canada, we have several bills which in principle forbids, entering merchandise tainted by slave labor. We have good legislatives. Our cabinet, our government is very, keen to portray itself as a defender and, combating these issues in the supply chain. But at the same time, when we come to the concrete steps, measures, nothing is implemented. And I would ask even like right now, Trudeau was in Mexico and the CUSMA agreement, Canada, US, Mexico free trade agreement, what we're doing or what we are not doing as a Canada, as a country, it is contrary and it's in the breach of our own international obligations. Canada became dumping ground for merchandise tainted by slave labor force. So I'm afraid it might be happening same with Bill S223. How about concrete measures? How about follow-up? Do our authorities equipped? Do they know? Do they share intelligence? Do they have resources, human resources, and to persecute, to investigate? Do they possess enough intelligence? So there are many question marks to follow up. So that is my concern. And judging from past experience of inaction on many different levels, on many different fronts, I'm not very optimistic that this will be like followed through and it will be implemented robustly as we, civil society, would like to see.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's inevitably a greater challenge enforcing laws that prohibit activity outside of our borders, right? So the same principle with forced labor as with organ harvesting, where if the legal determinations are dependent on some ability to make findings of fact that relate to things happening in other places, enforcement is necessarily going to be much, much more challenging. I think part of the idea with organ harvesting and trafficking was that there is some medical follow-up required when someone receives an organ transplant. And so that's maybe one potential advantage that isn't as much there around the the forced labor side of it. On forced labor, some different issues around enforcement. I think we really need to collaborate better with our allies, right? We have this commitment now with the U.S. and Mexico to combat forced labor, but we're not coordinating, I think, nearly as effectively as we could be and we should be. Grace, what are your thoughts on this enforcement issue? How do we, recognizing that there are inevitably going to be some challenges, how do we ensure meaningful enforcement of this prohibition on organ harvesting and trafficking?
I think that the law passed by itself is, I think, already empowered like our Canadians, like the people who have in the field, for example, the doctors, nurses, and also our health related workers or government agencies. I think there's probably needed to be, there's a more like information sharing on this. So people are aware, because like we care about this, we know, but lots of people don't know. They may still go to China. I think need some kind of education information to let more people know. I think that's the thing that will prevent it, at least to make sure all the organ transplant doctors know, because they can tell their patients in a way like not going. And the other thing is to go further with the legislation, for example, the mandatory reporting. Because the mandatory reporting was unfortunately removed, from during the debate. But that's very, very effective, because then that gives the doctors even more power to to help to prevent this, to implement this. So that's I think that's something I can think of. And with regard of go further, another thing is I can think it's about it's not about organ harvesting, but this foreign interference law, the legislation, because that's very much related to Canada. What the Chinese government has been doing in Canada, and so how we can restrain that, because lots of people actually working for the Chinese government, but they claim they're representing Canadians. They claim they represent the Chinese community in Canada. That's very deceiving, and also for some media, for example, for some organization, and for some institutes, like a Confucius Institute, like in US, they already say this is a foreign representative. For some Chinese media, it's also belong to foreign agencies. But in Canada, they all in the name of culture exchange, a relationship building, community building, and so they are really infiltrated into many aspects of our society, influence our politicians, and so in many ways. And I think that's very harmful to Canada. This is they are the agents of Chinese government, and so they have their motivations really conflict to Canada's interest, contradict to Canadian principles, our values. We need to protect ourselves. We need to protect Canada. And so we need the measures, and we need, I think the legislation is important.
Yeah. So just to kind of add to your comments on mandatory reporting, the original draft of the bill in a previous parliament would have required doctors to report on instances that they observed which looked like forced organ harvesting and trafficking, and similar requirements exist around gunshot wounds, child sex abuse, things like that. That there is generally the practice of doctor-patient confidentiality, that a doctor would respect the confidentiality of a patient even in cases where certain kinds of illegal activity are taking place, but there are certain exceptions to that already exist, and my view was and is that having that reporting mechanism is key for helping to track instances of organ harvesting and trafficking. If someone's been abroad, they've received an organ taken without consent, the best way to enforce that is to involve the medical profession. Now, that was ultimately taken out of the legislation because we needed to make some compromises to get it passed, but that doesn't prevent provinces from pursuing policies around reporting or other legislation. I think the medical profession is going to be critical for this next phase of this, right? Educating doctors, educating their patients, and working within medical bodies as well as with provincial governments to establish guidelines on reporting. So I see that as one of the one of the important next steps around this this initiative. Sherap, for your thoughts on kind of what's next, especially as it relates to the Tibet issue with S223 organ harvesting, that's a bill that's passed. On the genuine autonomy issue, it wasn't a bill, it was a motion. And when a motion passes the House of Commons, that's basically the House of Commons expressing its opinion. So, the cynics would say, so what, I guess. But this does actually involve not only Parliament, but the Government of Canada taking a particular position, endorsing the middle way approach. We would hope that will translate into concrete international advocacy and the building of coalitions of countries that will use the tools at their disposal to put pressure on China. What do you see as next steps coming out of the adoption of this motion on genuine autonomy?
Oh, no, as you said, this really puts some sense of pressure and responsibility on the part of government to really take a concrete action, although it's not a bill. But I think this support is the fact that all 324 MPs who were there on that day in the House of Commons voted for the motion with zero opposition. I hope it means something. And we hope to see Prime Minister Justin Trudeau really personally making a statement calling on the Chinese government to engage in a dialogue with the representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama or the representative of Tibetan people. We really hope to see that. As MP Rob Oliphant mentioned there, he talked about several issues there, but I was intrigued that when he mentioned that they would be interested for the reciprocal access to Tibet. I hope it's not just a statement in the debate, but we hope to see that in action as well. As we know, the former ambassador Dominic Burton visited Tibet in 2019, and for some reasons, without going into the details, there were certain areas that we were a bit concerned about his visit when he came back and briefed us on his visits. But we hope, when I totally agree that there should be reciprocity between Canada and Tibet and with the Chinese government, because Chinese officials from Tibet are free to come to any parts of Canada without any restrictions.
Can you explain kind of just the reciprocal access concept? Because I know that's a significant next ask. Just mechanics of it. What does that mean as far as Canadian law would be?
Any Chinese officials representing the so-called Tibet autonomous regions or the Tibet areas that is currently under China, as far as I'm aware, there's no restriction on their part to come to any part of Canada. And as we saw in 2018, they testified at the Foreign Affairs Committee, where you asked question on the whereabouts of Panchen Lama. But there's no reciprocity. There is strong restrictions on the part of Canadian officials, Canadian diplomats, Canadian journalists, Canadian media to have access inside Tibet. So one of the fundamental challenges that we deal with the Tibet has been the problem of access and flow of information coming out of Tibet. And that happens because there's no access inside Tibet. Tibet remains one of the most restricted nations in the earth, as reported by several sources, including Reporter Without Borders, including Freedom House. The point I am really interested in is the next visit, when it happens, should be non-partisan visit, Garnet. And I hope, that when that visit happens, they would include MPs from all parties, especially MPs who are well informed on Tibet, such as you. So that when that visit happens, it happens on a very meaningful ground, because we need MPs who would visit there and who would already have certain knowledge about Tibet issues. And we need people go there, although, most likely the visit will still be highly orchestrated, because without the involvement of Chinese state government, there's very less likelihood that visit would happen. But having said that, I would think that there would still be some level of autonomy for the visitors to engage in dialogue, to meet the kind of people. We want the visitors to visit, prisons. We want visitors to speak to the Tibetan monastic leaders, not just the Chinese government appointed officials.
Yeah.
We want them to visit significant places of Tibetan issues. Yes, Karna?
Yeah, but just in terms of the mechanics of a reciprocal access act. So we see the problem, right? That there is not reciprocal access. Is the implication of reciprocal access legislation then that somebody in Tibet government officials from the government of China, maybe nominally representing Tibet, maybe people from the Chinese embassy are in some ways restricted in their activities in Canada or what they can visit? Is it like we say, if we can't go to Tibet, you can't go to Nova Scotia, or is it, how does it work out mechanically?
I mean, if that happens, that would be interesting too. I think you would know this better. When Chinese government officials come to Canada, do they have any restrictions to not visit any part of Canada? I don't think so, right? I mean,
Correct.
once they get a visa to visit Canada, they could visit Vancouver, Toronto, Calgary, any city they would want to visit. And I don't think there would be Canadian police or RCMP watching them, 24 hours with security, traveling with them during their visit. But we saw, and we have experienced this, not just with the Ambassador Dominic Burton, but with the former Ambassador Saint-Jack, who we had a really wonderful discussion around the time when Ambassador Dominic Burton visited Tibet. And Ambassador Saint-Jack said, that when he visited Lhasa, he was under a lot of security presence to make sure that he doesn't meet people without the presence of Chinese government officials. And the fact that it took so many years for Canadian official to visit Tibet, that says, that the frequency of access to Tibet is very minimal. And we want to see that more frequency and not just limited to high-level delegates like ambassador, but to media as well, Canadian journalists, not when China wants it. And this visit, I think for the listeners may not be aware that this visit happened when China wanted the visit to happen, not when Canada wanted it to happen. The visit happened when there were other diplomats as well. So we want the visit to happen when Canadian officials make a request, not just when it's suitable for the Chinese government to have visitor visit Tibet.
Kayum, you wanted to weigh in on this whole question.
Yeah. I'd like to echo Sherap's on reciprocity question. A simple question: how many Chinese diplomatic personnel are stationed in Canada, and how many Canadian diplomats are there in People's Republic of China? Number two, China has consulates all across Canada, to my knowledge, in Calgary, Edmonton, Vancouver, Halifax, Montreal, etc. How many diplomatic stations Canada has in China? We need our ears and eyes on the ground, preferably in Lhasa, in Urumqi. Why not open there our missions, and observe what's happening on the ground? We've been advocating for this for almost 3 decades, and nobody's listening to us. It all boils down to the question of reciprocity. So we have to play fair game here. If we're allowing same treatment like to Chinese state, China should allow the same, same rules should be applied to us as well.
Yeah. So I think those are really legitimate points around diplomatic reciprocity, and it links back, I think, as well to foreign interference, right? I think when people point out that there is a massive disparity in terms of the number of diplomats, if you're talking about China, if you're talking about Russia, I think the implication is often that, when another country wants to be not just doing traditional diplomatic work, but trying to influence a broad range of institutions through some means that are inappropriate, they need more personnel to do that. So I think these are good points in terms of next steps. And I wonder if you can speak specifically to the future of China. It's interesting seeing some of these dynamics. On the one hand, you have President Xi seeming to solidify his position, but on the other hand, you have significant negative response within the public to some of the COVID policies, and I was very struck by the fact that it was a fire in Urumqi in the Uyghur region that actually sparked protests throughout China against the COVID zero policies in China, which suggested, I think, some sense of feeling of solidarity there. Where are things going with China? I guess one other like just data point to think about is how demographic shifts, the kind of aging of the population in China, are potentially going to impact China's economic growth trajectory, and how that will impact the legitimacy of political leadership. So where is China going? What does the future hold in terms of human rights, but also politics in China? What can we do about it?
I think that's kind of a continuation of what I talked earlier. Actually, that the Chinese Communist Party, they don't care about people. They don't care about people's life, about their wellness. They care only about the power and the communist legitimacy. Now it's the party leaders' legitimacy. It really comes when they like the communists. The strategy in the past is like they always to crack down on, like they say, 5%, like they call them the state enemy. The communist control is by like repression people, but like they only like targeting 5% of this group. Like in the different political movement since the communists took the power, it's the rightists, and then the landlord, then the cultural revolution, the Christians, the Catholic, and the Buddhists, Falun Gong, Tibet. So they take turns to oppress these people. But then so everybody else is 95%. They always say they try to be in the 95%, so they are out of it. But now the whole nation become target, because when the communists go to extreme, like then they don't care about people's life or their well-being. And so everybody now realize they cannot circle the 5% or 95% anymore. Everybody is kind of victim, and everybody become the victim of this communist rule, or their random policy or anything, right? It's on the bad side is the people are suffering. So we watch in great concern of what happened to those people for their sufferings. On the other hand, it's also probably a good opportunity for the turn for China, because the people start to realize they cannot hide anymore. They cannot, protect themselves anymore, because they have to stand up for their own right and for, just the basic right. And so I think that's, in a way, I think probably it's good for China in the future. It's turning point. And so I think what we can do is to support whatever necessary needed from outside. Like as in the Falun Gong community, we do a lot is quit the CCP or its affiliated organization, to deny its legitimacy. To change the country, the people in the country has to be changed. The people in that country have a mindset or action, conscience for what they want, what they need. They decide the future of that country, not the Communist Party. From our community, we do all our best. We have phone calls to China. We have broadcasting to China. We have mass email to China. We have done this for over 20 years with all kinds of media possibilities, communication possibilities to get their voice out. To get their voice out, because they have no power, because communist control all the communication channels, the medias. And so those mass people, they need to have a channel to get their voice more, and so they can resonate, they can connect, and they can encourage each other, right? They can inspire each other. And so that's something we can do. We do whatever we can and to support them, to Chinese people, for a better China.
Well, thank you for that work and for sharing that. I think one key takeaway from what you said is just this growing recognition that the victim pool is actually much broader than maybe people thought, right? That in different ways to different degrees, but that the COVID zero policies brought home that the repressive toolkit that is being most aggressively used against Tibetans, Uyghurs, in certain regions and certain minorities is actually they're tools that the Chinese Communist Party has intended to and is prepared to use more broadly.
So I think in the past so many years, the communists, I think, build a persecution machine, a repression machine. And they use a small group of people and they sharpen that machine. When they come to the persecution of Falun Gong, that's really lawless. there's no control, they arbitrarily do anything to this a large group of innocent people. And so then they apply this to all other groups, and now they apply to everybody. So the monitoring, the supervision, the cameras all over the country. It's not only in Tibetan or Uyghur, all over the country. They monitor all the citizens. The internet surveillance is applied to everybody. So it's a big prison, and people need to fight for themselves.
Yeah.
Well, I would speculate that we are at the beginning of the end. The regime is not self-sustaining.
Mm-hmm.
It is based on violence, and the violence is not stable. It cannot be stable. So I believe in the long term, we all might witness in our lifetime the demise of this Chinese Communist Party. But coming to the short term, I think the invasion of Taiwan is not the question of if Taiwan will be invaded, but the question when Taiwan will be invaded. And I think it will happen at the moment choosing of the CCP, when they will deem an opportune moment to invade Taiwan. And inside China, we will see more repression, more brutality, more violence directed at not only at Uyghurs, at Tibetans, but at the other groups. And and my message would be to the Canadian business mostly is that you cannot envision long-term investments and long-term relationship with China. So it is a high time to decouple, be aware, because it's coming. We probably should aim at the business world. These are corporates which are still investing and still doing business with China. So be aware of the social contacts in China. The big snowball is coming.
Yeah. Good points. Thank you. Sherap, your thoughts on where China is going in the future, and any closing comments?
Sure. I think China, the one area that not many international community is talking about is the China recent aggression in the Indo-Tibet border area. So we have seen strong signs and indication of China's expansionism in the South Asia areas, including mainly in the Indo-Tibet border area. Just last month, we saw Chinese army entering in the northeastern border of India in the state of Arunachal Pradesh. Last year and the year before that, we saw intrusion in the border area of Sikkim and Ladakh area. And just, I think 2-3 weeks ago, China inaugurated in the first international airport in the city of Nepal's second biggest city, Pokhara. This is seen as an important step in China's Belt and Road project in the South Asia area. We have increasing involvement in the politics of Nepal and this is a country that I actually grew up in. I grew up in Nepal, so I have a strong interest in and I've still family members in Nepal who have this direct impact of what's happening. So we have seen a lot of, I think, signs of expansionism. And so if we are to see where China is heading, I mean, it's certainly heading in so many directions, but one important area that is really heading towards is its aggression in the southeast border area. And so far, I believe India has been dealing it quite strongly, but we're yet to see what's really happening there.
That's also really fascinating. I mean, just maybe one quick follow-up on that. My understanding is, in the context of these tensions between China and India, the Chinese government is trying to use or employ Tibetans as part of their efforts. Tibetans know the terrain better, and the Indian government also is recruiting Tibetans to support their border efforts in the area. So in fact, what is a conflict politically is a conflict between India and China. You actually have Tibetans on both sides on the front lines, and that must create lots of challenges and but potentially also less will to escalate, right, when you've got people from the same community.
And many we all know about the stories of the forced relocation of Tibetan nomads, but what is lesser known is where they relocated, and many of those nomads are being relocated in the border area. They have been forcibly indoctrinated the sense of patriotism about their loyalty toward the communist government, so especially to those residing in the border area. It's very concerning, but for me as an activist, we're just saying, where does this all lead to?
Yeah. When you see a lot of darkness in the world, you can light a candle. And December 14th, we were able to pass the bill on organ harvesting and the motion on genuine autonomy for Tibet. I think those were important, meaningful steps. And I did want to bring us back together for this podcast to share with a bit of a wider audience, people who weren't able to be there on the day or maybe didn't see the news items around that. So thank you, Grace, Kayum, and Sherap for working with me on some of these initiatives, and of course for being here today. Folks, we publish Resuming Debate, my podcast, every 2 weeks, looking at a broad range of different topics. Yes, foreign policy, human rights, but also domestic Canadian issues, the issues of the day in longer form. We bring on guests from other parties as well. This is a platform where we try to have substantive conversation with experts, with people with different perspectives in other parties, and really broaden the conversation. So if you liked what you heard today, please like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. Leave a 5-star review, and we'll see you back again with another episode in 14 days.